The Ukrainian surprise offensive in Kursk is in its third week, and it appears to have reached the apex of its advance, as its progress has largely stopped with advances up to 22 kilometers or 14 miles into Russian territory. Resistance has been stiffening in front of the Ukrainian forces, and the initial Russian shock has passed and is moving new forces to the area. Despite this, it appears that the Ukrainian forces are limiting their offensive advance, and this appears to be the primary reason for the advance to stop, rather than being stopped by the Russian forces. The offensive has many plausible reasons, but Ukraine and its Western supporters have not stated the reason for the advance, which is a correct decision, and not communicated the objective to the Russians. This leaves the rest of the world wondering about the offensive's objective. One question arises: why is Ukraine's advance essentially stopping significant forward progress? There are several reasons for the Ukrainian forces to stop their advance and limit their depth. The Kursk offensive is a narrow front advance versus a broad front advance. As a result, the advance creates a salient that necessitates defense along its entire length. The deeper the advance, the frontage increases, necessitating more resources and manpower. Additionally, the salient's neck and shoulder require robust defense to protect the forward deployed units in the salient from encirclement. Secondly, the Ukrainian units aim to avoid advancing too far from their logistic bases and communication lines. The deeper Ukrainian forces advance, the longer supply lines become, and the more vulnerable they will be to attack. Even with their new F-16s, Ukraine cannot maintain air superiority over its own airspace, much less over Russian airspace. There are no reports of Ukraine moving their logistic bases closer to the Russian border or inside the Kursk oblast itself, which means they do not have long-term plans to stay. This is merely conjecture, as the absence of reports about the relocation of logistic bases to a more forward location does not necessarily imply that it is not taking place, given that logistics is typically not a topic of significant interest to the media. The other issue with cross-country movement in this region of Europe is the onset of the Rasputitsa, the mud season, due to the fall rains, which will make movement, including supplies, much more difficult for both Russia and Ukraine. Though Russia will have a slight advantage as it can use its road network more effectively to move forces closer to the front, as it is not as geographically limited as Ukraine forces operating within the confines of a salient, though they will have the advantage of shorter interior lines. The timing of the Ukraine offensive is also a reason for speculation. They launched the offensive near the end of the summer campaign season. This implies that the Russians may not be able to reclaim their territory before the expected start of the mud season in October, unless they can swiftly and effectively counterattack to reduce the salient. The result is that Ukraine is increasing the likelihood of holding Russian territory until the onset of winter and the freezing of the ground, which will restore cross-country movement. This would be a significant achievement for Ukraine, demonstrating that the summer campaign season ended with Ukraine taking the initiative. The other option for the offensive's timing is again based on the mud season. The Ukrainian armed forces can operate in the Kursk oblast for a few more weeks, while the Russians gather their forces to counterattack. The Ukraine forces then start a phased withdrawal, maintaining good order of its forces back to the international border, and being back or just forward of the international border prior to the onset of the Rasputitsa. This implies that Ukraine's success in the final major operation of the summer season will overshadow, at least in the media, all the Russian victories in the Donbass during the spring and summer campaign seasons. Ukraine would also end the summer campaign season with the initiative, at least in the world of public opinion, and perhaps even Russian societal opinion. Ukraine has the upper hand in either scenario, even though Russia has not stopped its Donbass campaign. The Russians have limited forces to immediately respond, so the Ukraine offensive has impacted Russia in a negative and unexpected way. Additionally, the Russian campaign in the Donbass is already well established, whereas the Kursk offensive was not. This reinforces, at least in the press and among the Russian and Ukrainian populations, that Ukraine has taken the initiative in the war. This issue of maintaining support from the population is important to both Russia and Ukraine. Since its proposal in the spring of 2022, Russia has avoided a general mobilization and the drafting of conscripts for the war due to its unpopularity with the Russian population. Consequently, the Russian government abandoned the plan and turned to volunteers and contractors to fight the war within Ukraine, hoping to sustain public backing for the conflict by shielding a significant portion of the Russian populace, particularly in Moscow and St. Petersburg, from the war's impact. Due to the offensive, the Russian people are experiencing the war in the Kursk region, as well as the Belgorod region, but more concerningly, many of the units encountered and prisoners taken by Ukrainian forces were primarily made up of conscripts. This has resulted in the imposition of unpopular issues, such as general mobilization and the use of conscripts, on a population that was not particularly supportive of the idea in 2022. The occupation of Russian territory and the capture of conscripts have the potential to weaken support for the war. To fully capitalize on the Kursk offensive's societal impact on the Russian population, Ukraine's forces must ensure the well-being and humane treatment of Russian conscript POWs from the Kursk operation. The Ukrainian population is showing signs of war fatigue, with the most recent poll from Ukraine's non-occupied regions showing that 44% of the population is willing to negotiate with Russia to end the war. This has been a sharp spike since the beginning of the war and has been growing steadily since the spring. The Kursk operation is a boost to the Ukrainian population's morale, and the timing of the offensive, as mentioned above, ensures the lingering benefits of the offensive will stay with the population over a longer period of time. Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is also attempting to persuade the Russian government to join the peace talks tentatively scheduled for November. Ukraine needed a military victory to strengthen its bargaining position in any negotiations with the Russians. The initial reaction from Russian President Vladimir Putin's government was that Russia would not negotiate with Ukraine because of the operation in Kursk. The Russian reaction suggests that the Kursk operation, which aimed to encourage Russia to engage in negotiations, has backfired. In Qatar, Russia and Ukraine engaged in secret negotiations to halt attacks on their energy infrastructure, with the expectation that a successful outcome could pave the way for a comprehensive war ceasefire. At this juncture, the Kursk offensive ended these negotiations without a settlement. This Russian reaction indicates that the Kursk operation delayed the end of the war, but this is not necessarily the case. One cannot expect the Russians to consent to peace talks while the Kursk offensive is ongoing. The Russians would appear to be agreeing to peace talks as a result of the offensive, entering the talks from a perceived position of weakness. The Russians cannot do that, but the reality of the Kursk offensive is real, and it has a real cost to the Russians. Although the Kursk offensive may exert pressure on Russia to engage in peace talks in the future, the Russians have already reached out to their international partners to negotiate a prisoner exchange with Ukraine as a result of a large number of conscripts being captured in the Kursk oblast. Both Belarus and China are attempting to push forward peace talks, with Belarus creating an anti-Western common cause between Russia, Belarus and Ukraine. China also offered financial help Ukraine under the Belt and Road Initiative when the war ends, in exchange for Ukraine recognizing the One China policy when the Ukrainian foreign minister was invited to Beijing for talks about the war. Due to the threat of Western sanctions on Chinese banks and the potential loss of higher profitability of trade with the West versus Russia, China's trade of dual-use products with Russia has significantly decreased since the summer. This puts additional pressure on the Russian economy, and a significant downturn can also impact societal support for the war. If Ukraine manages the Kursk offensive effectively and prevents it from turning into a military disaster that could reopen the northern front, which hasn't been opened since the winter of 2022, and pose a threat to Kyiv, it can fully reap the benefits. This also means that Ukraine must absolutely treat Russian POWs, especially conscripts from the Kursk offensive, humanely and in accordance with international rules of war. The capturing of conscripts is concerning for Russia, and Ukraine needs to avoid mistreating POWs to prevent Russian society from rallying around the war effort. The West and Ukraine must also prevent the Russians from redefining the Kursk offensive's purpose as sabotaging the progress of the Qatar talks, thereby impeding a ceasefire. The Ukraine war is at a point where there is a lot of pressure to negotiate an end to it. The war is in a delicate phase now, as both sides appear to be attempting to strengthen their bargaining positions while resisting the hawks, who want to continue the war and derail peace.